All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Alexandria Library in its celebration of Women's History Month. My name is Megan Zimmerman, and I'm an adult services librarian with the library, and I'm very excited to share this afternoon with a local author and podcaster, Rita Mattia. During our time today, we're going to get a chance to talk to Rita about her writing and also hear a few of her essays that she's written in her books. At the end of the talk, you're muted right now, but you'll have a chance to unmute and ask questions if you like, or you can also use the chat to post questions and we'll get those read to Rita. This event is being recorded and will be made available on the library's YouTube page sometime later this week.
Thank you.
Our author and guest is Rita Mattia. She is hard to pin down. As I was getting ready to write her introduction, I realized it was difficult to find a nice and concise biography about her life accomplishments. Instead, what Rita has given us is she's compiled her biography through memories and essays, which she's published in 2 books, Trying Stuff, a collection of recollections, which was published in 2020, and Rita Writes and Reads, the podcast and musings of Rita Mattia, which came out at the end of last year. Thank you, Rita, for putting those up. Rita lives in Alexandria and has lived in New Jersey, Baltimore, Richmond, among other places, and has tried her hand at many trades, fortunately for us, which includes writing. Rita is an impressive knitter, and she has a huge heart. So Rita, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, and I look forward to talking with you.
Thank you so much, Megan. And hi, everybody.
So before we get into some of those essays, I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions.
I hope you will.
All right. So starting with the first one, why did you decide to write these 2 books?
Really good question. I have told you this before. I kept thinking that somewhere in me there was the great American novel, that I would be on the bestseller list at the New York Times with this blockbuster novel that would be made into a film and maybe a miniseries, and oh my God, I would get rich. But every time I tried to write fiction, it was horrible, really, really bad. And I became discouraged. And then one day I was cleaning out some files, and I found this file just called Rita Writes. And I thought, what's in this? And it was different times, on different occasions, I would write a short essay about what I was feeling that day, or something that had happened, or something I remembered that I didn't want to lose. And then I would stuff it in this folder. And when I read it, I thought, man, this does a lot better than any of that fiction I tried, a lot better. And so I decided to try to edit it and perhaps create a book. And then, bam, COVID. And I was trapped at home, and what better time to do it? And so that's how the first book happened.
That's great. So some of these stories you've been collecting throughout your life, is that right?
That's true. Well, if not throughout my life, certainly in the last half of it, yes. When I was younger, I was too busy living it to write anything down.
Makes sense. So in addition to these books, you've also started a podcast. How is writing a book different or similar to producing a podcast?
Well, of course, the production is entirely different. And I'll circle back to that part of the question. But what happened after I finished writing the first book was it wasn't even in print yet. And I kept thinking, oh, rats, what about this story? Oh, what about the time this happened? What about that? So I started writing those down, and I thought, oh, heck, I'm not going to publish another book. What'll I do with these? And a friend of mine said, I can teach you how to do a podcast. And I thought, sure, at my age, I'm sure I'll learn that readily and I'll be so good at it. Luckily, I have a son. And so between the 2 of us, we figured it out. And I began to record those stories, those new stories. And then I thought, well, gee, some of the stories from the first book are pretty good, and this audience is different. So then I started recording them. So the upshot of it was that there were 55 new stories and about 15 old stories that I decided to make into a podcast. So there were 70 podcast episodes, and then I stopped, and they're still up, but I am not adding new ones to them. And so those newer ones, they were just sitting there, and then I thought, oh, hell, I'll make another book. So that's why the second book is called Rita Writes and Reads, because that is the name of the podcast. But doing a podcast, there's a lot of different ways to do it. And what I chose to do was pre-record it. And so each of them was already a package and to be uploaded and put online on a podcast hosting company. If you've ever heard my podcast, the introduction and lead in and lead out music is really wonderful, and was composed by a good friend in Richmond, whom some of you probably know. His name is Matthew Costello, and he's a wonderful actor and a wonderful musician and composer. And I was thrilled when he agreed to create that for me.
That's great. I was wondering if it was just music that you happened to find, or if it was a personal person that
I asked him if he could combine Cole Porter with, oh gosh, no, I can't remember. Cole Porter was somebody, and I felt like he did. There's that kind of lyrical.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's an energetic tune. He's wonderful.
Yeah, it's perfect for the podcast. Yeah,
it is.
Going back to how you sort of organized your books, they're not necessarily in chronological order. They're more like as you were pulling up stories or memories with friends. And I was wondering, how did you decide to organize the chapters in your books?
That's another really good question. You've read the book. You've read at least one of these books, I know, maybe both. Some stories are angry. Some stories are sad. Some stories are really funny, I think. And some are from the history of my family. Others are crazy things I've done or experienced. What I wanted to do was vary the pace so that a person wouldn't read 15 sad stories in a row and think, my God, this woman has had a miserable life. So that's what I did. I kind of categorized them: heartbreaking, hilarious, interesting, historic, and then just kind of rotated through them.
That was a great idea. Yeah, because it really helps you, like, as you said, you don't get too down, but you can definitely reflect back on what you've just read and then take a breather with a funny one or a lighter one. So
I've also said that it's like many other good books, I think. It's a great bathroom book. They both are, because you can read for 5 minutes and then come back to it, and you haven't lost the thread, and you're going someplace else with me.
That's so true. Yeah, it's definitely something you can pick up and set down and just enjoy for a few minutes or read all the way through.
Yes, yes.
One more question I have for you, and then maybe we'll get into some of your stories. I was thinking there must be hundreds of anecdotes or memories from your life. How and why do you decide which stories to publish?
That's another good question. One of the things, you're a good questioner. One of the things that was hardest to do was make sure that I didn't embarrass or hurt anyone else. Certainly, I could tell you a story right now that would humiliate someone that's here right now. It's, but I wanted to make sure that didn't happen. So that was one filter. And in the book, sometimes I change people's names because before publishing it, I asked every single person who is in a story, how do you feel about my using your first name? Or would you rather that I don't even tell this story or whatever? Because every single story involves someone else. And so there were stories that will never see the light of day, because there's no way to write them without doing that one thing that I would never do. So that was one filter. And another was, how many pages are in a book? Do I think some are better than others?
Great. Well, would you be willing to share some of these stories with us?
You would break my heart if you didn't let me read. But now what I've done, I'm not reading from the books because I didn't want to go flopping around and flipping around. And so I've written a little introduction to the stories that I'm going to share today, and then I'm going to read some stories. And after each story, you may have something else you'd like to ask me about them. So I had a harder than expected time choosing stories to share today, which is kind of a good segue from what you just asked me. But it is Women's History Month. And that nudged me toward telling everyone about my great-great-grandma, whose name was Filomena Ilaria Mattia. And here she is. Da-da-da-da. There she is. There she is. Filomena survived an 1876 shipwreck to journey from Italy to the United States, crossing the Atlantic Ocean 3 times to get here, and became part of the founding families of Little Italy in Newark, New Jersey. Oops, there goes the punchline. She didn't drown. Oh, well. Another great-grandma, born of Irish parents in Glasgow, Scotland, arrived in New Jersey about a decade later. Her name was Christina McCormick Maloney Martin, and things went far less well for her than they did for Filomena. Here's a really bad photo of her with an unidentified grumpy man. Now, my grandma, Effie Eon Kallenberger Mattia, a live wire redhead born in 1892, may have made history as a woman simply by putting up with my Italian-American grandpa Angelo for 20 years. Here she is having fun without him. I've enjoyed writing about her, and I have many charming photos of Effie, but I've decided to leave all 3 of those ladies for your reading pleasure in my books. And I'm going to begin instead with a story about my mother, also named Christina, but affectionately known as Teeny. Raised in abject poverty and then struck down by a cruel and debilitating disease, Teeny was always ready with banter, Band-Aids, and a bowl of butterscotch pudding. She was and is and will always be my hero. And as some of you know, today would have been Teeny's 105th birthday, which is why I simply have to read this, the first story from the first book first. You'll find Teeny and me on the front cover of Trying Stuff. Dun, 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 dun. And you will also find us both on the back cover of the second book. All right. I hope you'll all agree that this ever so slightly salty tale seems perfect for today's audience, if not for the saltiness, then for our virtual venue in the library. I may insert a bleep or two. We'll see. They're all just words, right? My father, Matty, and his father, my grandpa, Angelo, were born in this country. In fact, my Italian great-grandfather arrived here as a toddler. Yet, when swearing commenced, the go-to language in my father, Matty's extended family was invariably Italian. Chances are pretty good you've already heard all those words in the Godfather movies and on The Sopranos, so I won't list them here. Where I'm headed instead with this is that it was my American-born Grandpa Angelo who taught me how to swear in context when I was about 2 years old in English, so that I could be understood by everyone around me. When my parents chastised him for this, he shrugged and he said, "Hey, they're just words." Here's a peek at me at the age when I started swearing. Aw. When recalling those days, my mother, Teeny, with a blend of pride and shame, told and retold the story of riding on a bus with me through downtown Newark, New Jersey, when I was not so far past my second birthday. As we passed a large construction site, I stood up on my seat, pointed out the window at the first steam shovel I'd ever seen, and shouted for all our fellow passengers to hear, "Oh, that one's a bleep of a big digger." Oops. And then there was my first trip to a movie theater in 1946. We went to see the new Disney film, Peter and the Wolf, with its elegant animation, delicious Prokofiev, I can never say that well, score, and masterful Sterling Holloway narration. Up on my seat again, I shouted a warning to Sasha the bird. Don't go in there. You saw what they did to the damn duck. Well, we ducked out of the theater. In fact, by the time I was 3, I had quite an enviable vocabulary, both salty and socially acceptable, and I was reading books. Why? Because the more Angelo tried to make a miniature sailor of me, the harder Teeny, who had finished only 4th grade, worked to make sure I would become a scholar. She needs a card, she said to the librarian in the children's department of our New Jersey town library, while I gazed around the room in awe. I've never been quite as good with numbers as with words, and there were books as far as the eye could see. I couldn't even imagine how one could ever read or count them all. Looking down at my tiny self, I was always small. The librarian asked, "What grade is she in?" Well, she hasn't started school yet. She's not quite 3, but she loves to read. Bring her back in 2 years. We have rules and she has to be in school. Ignoring her, my mother commanded, "Go get a book." Scared, exhilarated, obedient, all at the same time, I grabbed one that looked familiar. Now, start reading. I opened a beloved Beatrix Potter and began. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits. The librarian allowed my mother to sign for me, and we were off and running, each with a book to savor, and I with my first library card. I like to believe that Teeny was thinking, bleep, that was fun. But she didn't swear nearly as much as I did back then.
That's great. Thank you so much for including the library as well in that story. It sounds like from a young age, you were sort of being groomed for narratives by your mother's encouragement for you to read and by your grandfather's encouragement to keep it interesting. Have you always been a storyteller?
Well, I've always been a talker. My mother saved my report cards, and on one of them from maybe 2nd grade, she said, "Rita never shuts up." I would say most of my friends would say the same about me.
I also like with this particular story, it seems like a tale that your mother would have told you as you were growing up. And I know that your mother was very important to you. How does having family lore like this connect you to your mother and your other family members?
Oh boy. You and I have talked about this sort of thing before. Humans have been telling stories forever. Long before there was writing, there were stories. And one of my favorite writers is Louise Erdrich, who writes about her Ojibwe ancestry and how families passed stories down for thousands of years. And I like to think that the stories my family has told me and the stories I'm leaving behind for future generations are all a part of that human condition and something that not only pulls me closer to my own family, but makes me more of a member of the human family. Because the things that I talk about in my stories are not too different from things that happen to everyone else. One of the things that I have loved most when people have read my books or listened to my podcasts is when someone sends me an email and says, "Oh, you reminded me of my grandma and when she did this," or "You reminded me of when my brother used to beat me up," or whatever. And suddenly they're telling me their story, and that's humanness, and it's warm, and it fuels my life.
That's beautiful. Would you like to share another story with us?
You know I would. And I'm not, for those of you who get tired easily, there are 104, but you're not going to hear them all today. From my second book, the one that calls heavily upon the stories originally created for the podcast of the same name, Rita Writes and Reads, comes this one, which is called Deus and That Machina. I often ask those who read or hear this 100% true story if they'd have made the same decisions I did nearly 50 years ago as a struggling single mom. Here we go with another story that might just also take us briefly inside a library. In some ways, the first year of my baby's life was really a piece of cake. Excuse me. For one thing, it coincided with one of my own healthiest, calmest years. I was 30 and in the prime of life. For another, I was able to keep it pretty simple paraphernalia-wise. I had a pair of built-in baby meal dispensers, had been gifted dozens of cotton diapers, and there was a washing machine in my apartment. Here's a peek at my baby and me. The baby himself was usually cheerful and easygoing. And although I rarely seemed to have access to the car I shared with my husband, I had a lightweight, bright blue cotton sling from which the baby could dangle from my shoulder, my chest, or my back when I set out on various neighborhood adventures. All was not perfect in paradise, however. There was that little matter of paying the bills. Oh, my husband was bringing in very little money at that point, in fact, none. And although I had been a reasonably successful advertising copywriter for 7 years, I had, up to this point, never been a saver. And we were living in a town where freelance work was less than scarce. And although my boss was eager to hire me back, I'd worked till my due day. I really, really wanted to be home with my baby 24/7 for maybe 6 months. Then, when my son was about 3 months old, and things were looking mighty bleak, it was time for a bit of, as my theater friends like to call it, a bit of Deus ex machina. There it was, an ad in the classified advertising section of the local newspaper. Yep, that's how we figured out such things back then. And they were looking for qualified research writers. Over the years, I'd frequently researched products and services before writing ads about them. Sometimes an ad agency handed me a chubby file to wade through. Sometimes I headed to the library, thanked Dewey for his wondrous decimal system, and hauled back a few books to read before firing up my typewriter. Heck, I had once researched and written a 48-page booklet on the care and feeding of show rabbits for an animal feed company. So I called the phone number in the ad, pitched myself a bit, and was invited to come to their offices and pick up a trial assignment. Well, I'd be a liar if I said it was easy to come to their offices. Slightly inconvenienced by the infant swinging from and slinging to my body, and greatly inconvenienced by the 2 bus rides we had to take to a dubious-looking building in a decidedly seedy neighborhood, I nonetheless arrived on time, notebook in hand. "You can do this," I said to myself. Well, yes, I could. And what an irony. I had walked into a place catering to very well-heeled, undermotivated persons enrolled at a few local universities. I hesitate to call them students of those schools. And though all this took place almost a half century ago, and a lot of technology has changed, some things, it seems, never do. Wikipedia's current definition describes the place I walked into almost a half century ago just perfectly. A term paper mill is a business that allows customers to commission an original piece of writing on a particular topic so they may commit academic fraud. Customers provide the company with specific information about the essay, including a page length, a general topic, and a time frame with which to work. What was the irony? Well, although I was pretty much a straight A student for the first 13 years of my education, I could only be described as an academic slacker in college. So we'll pause here for some details before I reveal what I decided to do on that summer afternoon, seated in a dubious looking building in a decidedly seedy neighborhood with a baby on my lap. The mill was paying writers $5 a page in cash to write these papers, which were on average about 8 typewritten pages long. So let's say I would have been paid $40 to write somebody's term paper on, say, the influence of William Shakespeare on the comedy of the Marx Brothers. That would be almost $250 in today's dollars. If I could turn, say, 4 papers a week, I'd be hauling in the modern day equivalent of $50K a year. Not too awful, and all cash, while breaking the law, but while needing to pay rent, but while needing to keep the lights on, but while needing to buy food. And heck, I was already out bus fare for that day. Okay, I'll try a few, I said. And my baby and I got on the bus that would take us to the large downtown Baltimore Public Library, not far from where we lived. Pretty much every day, I'd speed read a few books while switching my baby from one side to the other under my shirt, put the sleepy angel down in his crib, and compose and type up a tidy term paper. Each week, when all the papers were done, we'd ride the 2 buses, deliver the goods, get our money, and head to the library with our new assignments, including travel, research, and writing. Well, I spent about 30 hours a week on this. There were, however, several flies in the baby ointment. For one, I never had the slightest idea whether I delivered an A+ paper or a C- one. My best guess is that there were a lot of B+ in there, but I never knew. And yet, here I was doing the caliber of work that might have earned me a much better GPA, folks. Yes, I could have done better in college. There was a lot of regret-filled sighing over that. A lot. The other, possibly larger issue mentioned earlier was the lawlessness of this activity. Hoping against hope that all the statutes of limitation have expired here, I will tell you that over the course of several months, a half century or so ago, I swallowed my ethics whole and received more than a few tax-free dollars. In fact, many thousands of them. My child was about 7 months old, and yes, getting more than a bit heavy to haul around on the fall afternoon when we arrived at that dubious-looking building with 3 or 4 of those neatly typed papers in hand. The note on the door was terse. As they say in gangster movies from the 1930s, the joint was raided, and I would never get paid for those last few papers. But I had learned to save, and we had amassed a nice little nest egg that carried us for the month or so it took me to find an outstanding daycare mother who lovingly cared for a few infants and toddlers in her home and was located halfway between our apartment and the advertising job my old boss was still holding for me. Now, I earned far less money than I had writing about the Marx Brothers, especially after paying for daycare and those pesky taxes. But it was so nice to have health insurance again, and I liked my coworkers. Then, just 2 years later, that Deus delivered another machina to us when we moved to Richmond, Virginia for a really good, legitimate job. A podcast story entitled The Real Baby Bed is all about that transition. And you can also find that story in my first book, Trying Stuff. But for today, I'd like to close with this. Please resist the urge to judge me. Hey, I might have written the A+ papers that got your favorite uncle through undergraduate school, after which he changed his slacker ways and became an attorney, fighting for the rights of the downtrodden. You never know. Those machinas can work in some very strange ways.
Thank you so much, Rita. I see some clapping up there. I have to agree. This is a very funny story, but not necessarily the most flattering. Why Why is it important to you to include these stories in your books?
Good darn question. They all are. I'm, if I had written, if I had published books about how perfect I am, no one who knows me would have believed them. And we all do make decisions in our lives that uh, that are not easy to make. And I felt like by sharing this one of my own, and you know, I made the decision on the spot, sitting there in that chair with my baby on the lap, and I didn't know what I was getting into. But I'm a mother. I had a baby to feed. You know, mothers kill. All I did was write papers, term papers. So as I said, you know, you could judge me, but I think a reader won't. I think a reader instead will think about sometime in their own life when they went one way or the other, and maybe they're proud of it for one reason or another. I'm not ashamed that I did this. I fed my baby. I paid the rent.
Yes, yes. I mean, and that makes sense. And
And I
that's
really hurt the other kids in that class who didn't have me writing their papers. I know that.
Many of the essays that you write speak to, as in this case, maybe a lesson learned, or you show that you have developed empathy for others that may be in similar situations. Are you aware of these aspects before you start writing these down, or does it sort of come up as you start to write them?
I'm not aware. I'm just remembering something that happened, whether it was for some reason it's memorable, it's important to me. And when I'm done, as I'm wrapping, no, not as I'm wrapping it up, as I'm editing it, then I ask myself questions like that. Can I make this particular story stronger? Can I make this particular story more interesting if I think about the reader as well? And that often informs how I edit them.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm so glad you do that. It really adds a depth to many of the stories. I've really
thank you.
Been warmed by your compassion that sort of comes out in many of the stories that you write and tell. And then one question, you don't have to answer this necessarily. If you had to do it all over again, would you make the same decision?
Yes. Yes, I would. You know, my baby was 3 months old. I was 3 months into earning no money. My husband wasn't earning any money. The rent was late. I don't know if it was better or worse than robbing a 7-Eleven, but I did what I had to do.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, I think you have a couple more stories. I think right now would you like to read one more?
Sure enough. And in fact, as you know, because you know where we're going with this next story is one that you found particularly appropriate to this month's theme, women's history. It is from the second book, and I know some of this is hard to believe, some of this is hard to swallow, some of it's even hard to listen to. The thing is, I don't know how to write fiction, and this is really what it was like for me in a certain phase of my career. And the story is called, and I know some of you will relate to this, Just a Girl. I guess one of the reasons I've been hesitant to write about some of these experiences is the look of disbelief I see on the faces of young men and women when I tell stories from my early years in the advertising business. Oh, the eye rolls are the worst. And yes, I know some of this is hard to swallow. But folks, I'm here to tell you I'm not making up any of this. And I'm also here to remind you that I have never been hesitant to laugh at myself. But even I have my limits. So in the mid to 1960s, I was young. I was still cute then. I had long, thick, shiny brown hair that I could flip around at will, had bright green eyes, and pretty much all year round a golden tan. The carcinomas would come later. In other words, in my mid-20s, I was a young woman with looks that men, or for that matter, women, might give a second glance. I was also doing pretty well in my career. I was working in a hot advertising agency in Baltimore, Maryland, and I was the only female in the entire 25-person creative department. Decades later, the term glass ceiling would be coined. I guess you could say I was one of the women who left a few fingerprints on it when I landed that job in the mid-1960s. We had pretty exciting national accounts to work on. Heck, we had beer, a baseball team, a theme park, and it was a high energy place. I was psyched to be part of it. And at first, things weren't too bad. My male coworkers called me the girl and tried to embarrass me with things they'd put on my desk whenever I stepped outside my cubicle. And when we moved to a new office building, there was a lot of grousing because the girl got the office closest to the soda machine. But then things escalated quickly. On one occasion, my art director partner, David, and I presented our concepts for a campaign for that theme park to our creative director. I think his name was Bob, and that will do for this story. Guys, he said, I don't like any of these ideas. Go back and try again. Well, now this was neither unusual nor upsetting. Sometimes Bob loved our work. Sometimes he didn't. We weren't hurt or angry. It wasn't personal. We were energized. We were ready to take another shot at it. Until this. As we walked out of his office, Bob added, the work wasn't so good today, but bleep, Rita sure has one nice bleep. That time, at least, there was no appreciative audience to laugh at his remark. But I was not always so fortunate. On another occasion, all 25 of us were gathered in a huge conference room to be briefed by one of the agency's top dogs. All of us were asked to come up with ideas to help land the big account. Had the meeting gone differently, I might be able to recall who or what that hoped for client was, or whether we even got it. This is what I recall instead. A few minutes into the briefing, I raised my hand and I asked a question. It was not something Mr. Top Dog had considered, but he had a ready answer for me that the men in the room were soon roaring with laughter. He said, Rita, apparently you are unaware that there are only two ways I like my women, flat on their backs and silent. Here's a peek at some of my barely contained rage on a typical day in that office. Okay, there she is, stamping out of a meeting. And yes, a coworker took my picture. And yet, my friends, that was still far from the worst of it. One night, a few years earlier, around 2 a.m. actually, Larry, the married man who owned the small nondescript agency I was working for then, knocked on my apartment door. I let him in, thinking there must be a reasonable explanation. Flat tire in my neighborhood? He and a lot of my coworkers had been to my place for a holiday party. He knew where I lived. Make me a sandwich, Larry said. Slipping into a robe and wondering what the heck was going on, I went to the refrigerator. Coming up behind me and reaching his arms around me, he said, and I'll take a cold beer too. I turned around pretty quickly and told him to get out of my home, which he did, without a sandwich or a beer or anything else. The next morning, my job was eliminated for budget reasons. And for better or worse, that's when I got the job at that larger, hot agency with all those cool national accounts. Okay, we're back to that agency. David and I were doing a lot of really good work. Some of it was up for industry awards, and we were about to find out what we had won at the annual Big Advertising Award event. The sponsoring organization was the Advertising Club of Baltimore, and this evening was a really big deal for all of its several hundred members. Anticipating a moment of glory when I'd be called forward to receive a little trophy or plaque of some sort, I had really dressed up. which in those days, the mid-1960s, meant a little black velvet skirt that did not reach my knees, a frilly white satin blouse, and tall black go-go boots. If you don't know what they are, you can Google it. I confidently walked into the room where the pre-show drinking was in progress, and I looked around for David. Instead, the first people I saw were three other men from the agency. I remember one fellow's name best because it was he, Joe, who loudly said to the others, "Hey guys, I think it's Rita." Then he walked up to me, knelt on the floor, looked up my skirt, and said, "Yep, it's Rita." His companions and the others in the room, mostly men, surprise, surprise, they were all men, nearly choked on their drinks, guffawing for, I don't know, 5 minutes. It seemed to go on forever. I did receive some awards that night. When I got home, I tossed them out. Why I kept going in that business for another 40 years or so is hard to explain. The money was good. Not so many years later, I was a single mom who really needed that money. This was post-term papers. And I did meet some nice people along the way. Some of you may even be here today. I don't know. Maybe my father's own disdain for me. In the hospital, he reportedly said to my mother, "You had a girl, a dang girl?" Maybe all that made me think I never deserved any better treatment. I don't know. But as years went by and I'd been to a therapist or two, I did begin to speak up. When a prospective freelance client in Richmond, Virginia, to which I'd relocated for that better job, said, "I don't want a little girl." Mind you, I was 35 years old at the time, working on my account, and no one spoke up for me. I walked out. So those are just a few of my stories from, say, 1966 to at least 1980 or so. And when I look back, I honestly can't say how I might or even should have handled those early events differently. Folks, there was no one and nothing on my side. What I can say is that young and maybe not so young working people today, irrespective of gender, cannot and must not let this happen to them. Speak up. You are valuable. You deserve respect from everyone around you. And damn it, so did I. But today, you have the courts and the press on your side. Don't you ever forget it.
Rita, thank you so much. It's such a powerful story. I want to give you a little time to take a breather from all that. But I even in your tears, the next question I want to ask gives me a bit of an answer to that. But is it difficult to revisit stories like this for you from your past?
It is. It is. A few years ago, there was a hugely popular show on television. You're all going to guess which one it was. It was called Mad Men. Hugely popular. Oh, the advertising back in the years when I began, and everyone said, "Oh, you're going to want to watch this. This is going to be so great." I watched one episode and I was in tears, and I said, "That's it. I don't want to think about those years." But eventually I said to myself, "Nope, you actually have to write about it. You do." And I did.
Well, I do appreciate it. I mean, it sounds very difficult to think back on it, but especially during Women's History Month, there's so many stories that go untold. So I appreciate you sharing your struggles and triumphs in your life.
Well, you know, that was 50 years ago. We're talking about women's history. Last month, it was Black history. Gosh, I get angry about the things that haven't changed. And I'm very passionate about the things that should.
You mentioned at the beginning of telling the story that people tend to pull away or sort of dismiss when you're telling the story. Why do you think they have that reaction?
I think among very young people, I think there's a lot of young people who really don't understand that there really were days like that. And when I start telling a story like that, I do get eye rolls sometimes, but I have to tell it. I just do.
Thank you. So we have just under 15 minutes left, and I'm trying to decide what would be the best thing to do. I definitely want to give our audience time to ask you questions, but I do know you have one more story laying in wait for us to hear.
It's a really sweet story. It's a bit of magical family lore, and I'll try to read a little faster. It's called That Garden in the Cellar. The stairs were steep, really, really steep. Some of my cousins have told me that when they descended to the low-ceilinged, windowless room below, they were frightened. Come to think of it, I believe they used the word creeped out when I asked not long ago if anybody else could remember what awaited us at the bottom of those stairs when we were children. I, on the other hand, was magically transported to a place created by our great-grandpa Petrino, known to our part of the family as Gramps. Petrino Buonaparte Mattia moved into the cozy third-floor suite in the Newark, New Jersey home of his son Virginius in 1946, not long after the death of my great-grandma Jesumina, his beloved wife of 60 years. Back in 1874, he'd been among hundreds of Southern European immigrants crossing the cold Atlantic in a sailing ship headed from Naples to New York. He, his brother, and their mother were among a handful of survivors when the fragile, overcrowded ship went down. Stories of their harrowing adventure vary, but one thing is certain. Petrino somehow survived because here I am, his great-granddaughter, telling you about something he did more than 80 years ago in a low-ceilinged, windowless room. Now, Petrino himself wrote much about his life. Day after day, he sat in that third-floor room alone, puffing on his pipe and scratching away in pencil on yellow-lined pads, eventually completing his memoir, details of those early years in America that would be painstakingly transcribed and published decades later. Gramps wrote lovingly and glowingly of his adventures and accomplishments, including creating oil and pastel portraits of locally famous, running a successful photography business shared with his brother, dining with the inventor Marconi, ambitious and sometimes spectacular adventures on and off the stage, and the rise of Little Italy in Newark, New Jersey, one of his 2 adopted cities in the New World. The other city was the very small Atlantic coast town of Highlands, New Jersey, where he and Jessie and their grown children and their children spent many happy decades. Of those years, Petrino was quoted in the local newspaper saying that of all the places he had lived in his long life, he loved Highlands best. Today, many of his descendants live in that area, a part of the Jersey Shore. And please allow me to digress just long enough to say, neither Highlands nor any of those towns our family settled in even remotely resemble that Jersey Shore. Okay, back to the house in Newark, where Petrino lived toward the end of his life. To a small person, the house was immense. A cousin and I cruised past it about 10 years ago and were shocked by how small it seemed. But the circa 1910 home boasted front and rear staircases, a fragrant kitchen and butler's pantry, and plenty of spaces for children to hide. The porch was immense and was surrounded by lush gardens, sometimes tended to by Petrino himself. And still, that was not the best of it. The best of it, for me, waited at the bottom of those steep stairs I mentioned earlier, the ones that creeped out some of my cousins. Gramps had taken his imagination, his palette, his paints, and his brushes to a large room in the cellar of the house, and through the magic of trompe-l'oeil, remember, he was involved in stage productions, he transformed a dreary cave-like space into a magical garden, complete with vines, blossoms, trellises, and even a wishing well. In retrospect, I would imagine that his Italian-born daughter-in-law, Laura, an amazing cook and hostess, and the beautiful wife of his son, greatly preferred family gatherings in her sunny, gracious dining room. But for Gramps and for a few like me, that room in the cellar magically recreated a piece of the motherland. It had become a sunny garden in Calabrito, the village in the Campania region of Italy, where a century before, Petrino's father, Angelo Maria Mattia, had tended a flock of sheep on a mountainside, while his wife, Filomena, had kept a small garden. Perhaps her garden was filled with vines. blossoms, trellises, a wishing well. And gosh, it was fun to party with the family in that room. Far less formal than Laura's dining room. This was a place for pure fun. It was a place where huge platters of food and jugs of wine were passed around, and so help me, people burst into song. The folk songs of Naples, the ones just about everyone associates with Italy. Santa Lucia, Funiculi, Funicula, La Tarantella. I promise you that if those titles mean nothing to you, the universally recognized melodies would instantly put you on a palazzo overlooking the Bay of Naples in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. I guess it goes without saying, doesn't it, that absolutely no one is aware of any photographs taken in that very special place, where many a noisy, loving family event was held. And I'm absolutely certain it has long since been painted over. The house has not been in our family for 40 years. Cousins, the ones who insist great-grandpa Petrino was known as Papa, have told me they recall visiting and living in homes in Highland where similar frescoes survived long after that man left us in 1953. They're all gone as well. So what's left? Well, I close my eyes. I can smell Gramps' pipe tobacco. I can hear his pencil scratching on those pads. And I can maybe hear someone leading a soulful rendition of Santa Lucia. Maybe, just maybe, it's the voice of Petrino. Arrivederci.
My apologies, Rita. I'm getting the picture of your grandfather up in just 1 second.
I can sing Santa Lucia poorly. La
Feel
la
free to do.
la 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 la. If you can't find it, we continue.
Okay, my apologies. Maybe I'll be able to pull it up in just a second.
That's okay.
Let's see. Oh, there we go. All right. Long delayed, but here it is.
There he is in his studio. Yes. Thank you, Megan.
No, thank you. Thank you. As we're taking a look at your great grandfather, you mentioned that he also wrote down his memories. Where are those now? And did they influence your desire to write down your recollections?
They are in, I have a PDF of them, and PDFs of his memoirs are in several libraries and historic collections. And if somebody here wanted to read it, they could just ask me and I'd send them a PDF. Did it influence me? No, I think it was just in me.
That is sweet. And I know we lost the mural that was in your grandfather's basement, but do any of the paintings that he did, do they still exist?
Oh, yes. Oh, you betcha. We have 4 of his paintings. I have 2 of the originals. One of my cousins has 2 others. And I have, I created reproduction about 20 years ago. I created reproductions, and I've shared those with cousins and friends, and still have some. If somebody is interested, again, contact me and I'll fix you up.
That's great. We have just a few minutes left. I'm going to make it so if you're interested in asking a question, you should be able to unmute yourself. If you could just either raise your hand or wave at me so I know that you're going to ask a question, that would be great. Otherwise, as you're thinking about a question you might ask Rita, I'll ask one more to her. So memories can be a tricky thing. It can be difficult to recall all the details of a particular event. So when you're writing a memoir, or in this case, your recollections, where and how do you draw the line to filling in the blanks?
I will always invent dialogue to tell the story. I never invent people, places, or events. This was something that you and I talked about, and I found this quote from the late Abigail McCarthy, who was the wife of Democratic politician Eugene McCarthy. She wrote this about memoirs. She said, "Every memoir reminds us of the far away and long ago, of loss and change, of persons and places beyond recall.
That's lovely. So we touched on this a little bit. You throughout your life sort of pushed against many constraints, being a single mother, working in the advertising industry, running your own business. Do you think of yourself as a women's history maker?
We all are. We all are. I'm just fortunate that the particular gift, one of the gifts that I have, is that of storyteller. So you know about mine, but we're all history makers. I think my friend Paige has something to say.
Yeah, so Paige shared in the chat, will you do more podcasts?
I'll tell you what, Chris really had to help. I'm going to give him a break for a while. And then one day I'm going to say, hey, Chris, I have a big idea, and it will probably be a little different. One of the things that I've thought about is maybe creating a podcast in which I tell stories that people have sent me because they've read my books or heard my podcast. Some of them are wonderful. I don't know if there's 104 of them though.
Well, we look forward to when you do, and if you do.
Thank you.
Jane writes in the chat, do you have any contact with women currently working in advertising to give them your perspective?
Yes and no. I have friends who are still in the business, and in fact, Paige in a sort of a tangential way is certainly in that business, as was her mother. And I would say that we would talk about the bad old days. I don't have any young friends in the business right now.
Well, hopefully some of them may stumble across your writings and find inspiration and strengthen those.
I hope so.
I have one more question for you, actually. How have your friends and family members responded to you publishing your memoirs?
I will not name the person who said, for God's sake, if you have to write those books, don't put me in them. But an ex-husband let me do it.
Oh, that's great. There's actually one more question in from the audience. Loretta asked, was your husband in on the tax evasion exercise?
The gentleman who was my husband at that time is deceased. He is my son's biological father, and I don't wish to answer questions about him.
Fair enough.
I'm sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine. Rita, this has been so wonderful. We are at the end of the hour. I thank you so much for sharing your stories and answering questions. It's been delightful to talk with you this afternoon.
Well, it's been an honor. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you so much. Hey, folks, read my books, and the podcast is still up. That's
right. And books available for sale as well, both online.
Yes, indeed. I have copies of this one that I can autograph, and anyone can get copies of this one online at Barnes & Noble.
Great. And we'll send out a follow-up email, including this recording, and also links to those books if you're interested in purchasing those. So thank you again, Rita, and thank you everyone who's been on this afternoon's call. This has been really fun.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Rita.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.